Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video from Aman Talks NRL SuperCoach. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the 5'8 position, looking at the best potential guns, mid-ranges and cheapies to consider for your round 1 squads. So if you all enjoy the video, really appreciate a thumbs up. Do please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and let's get straight into it. So taking a look at where the 5'8s have historically ranked in terms of top averaging players over the last 3 seasons. No surprises that Cam Munster has featured in the last few seasons, or actually in the last 3 seasons. Top averaging 5'8 last year with 81, 74 in 2021 and 70 in 2020, and even in the year before he was averaging 69. So essentially Cam Munster is just on a continual upwards trajectory in terms of SuperCoach averages. But a couple of new players in 2022, Dylan Brown had a breakout year in 2022. I think you all know my affection for the guy. Started with him in round 1 and I was able to hold him throughout the entire season, and he just really worked out for me. But also Scott Drinkwater had a great year for the Cowboys. Bit of a down year though for Cody Walker. Didn't feature in the 2022 top 20 averaging players, but he was the standout 5'8 in 2021. That was probably also just due to SuperCoach scoring being really conducive to attacking stats. We had those big blowout games where Cody Walker really did profit. But you had the likes of Adam Doueihi as well in 5'8 do really well in 2021. And a couple of other players there, Luke Keary in 2021, but again, very small sample size in that 75 average. I think he only had like 3 games. And then 2020, AJ Brimson had a really good year at fullback in the back half of that season. But I think you can see that Cam Munster has been the kind of standout, most consistent gun in the 5'8. But a couple of new players, Scott Drinkwater, Dylan Brown, maybe potential resurgence for Cody Walker from his pretty poor 2022 from a SuperCoach perspective. In terms of total points, again, it was Cam Munster and Dylan Brown who featured in the top 20 for total points. So those two really do stand out as kind of your premium 5'8s, at least based on last year's averages. But I think a lot of the questions around the 5'8 won't be related to the likes of Cam Munster or Dylan Brown. I think one of those guys, Adam Doueihi, who did well in 2021, he's definitely on people's radar. Matt Burton as well, lots of questions about them too. So let's get straight into tackling those hot topics. So starting off by looking at the guns category, I'll quickly just explain the table because there's probably a lot of stuff going on there. So I've got the player's price, their total points, average points, the percentage of games that they scored over 60, percentage of games that they scored over 100, as well as their ownership. You've obviously got the draw below that, and then below me as well, you've got a breakdown of their average based on either base, evasive, creative, and scoring stats. So as I mentioned in the previous section, Cam Munster, Dylan Brown probably are your 2 most premium, best quality options. I think that you can go for it in 5'8, and I really do think Munster stands out even above Dylan Brown. Dylan Brown did have a bit of a career year. Munster, again, his SuperCoach average was the best that he's actually done historically as well. But we've seen in the last 3 seasons prior to that, 69, 70, and 74 average. We know that Cam Munster is a gun. Surprisingly, his ownership is not as high as what I was thinking it would be. 14.7% owned for a guy who we know is just an out-and-out NRL and SuperCoach gun. Really consistent. 76% of his games he scores over 60, and that's really due in part to his base stats. If you look at the table below me, his average of 31 base is only topped by Dylan Brown. But someone like Munster, who very often gets tackle breaks and things like that, his base power numbers are really strong. So you're never going to get a bad score out of Cam Munster. But my criticism I think I had of Munster coming into last season was that I didn't really see as much of a ceiling from him, because I think he was more likely to get you between 60 to 80, 85, which is great. But you never felt like you kind of could captain him because he wasn't as consistently, in my opinion, hitting those 100+ point scores, but he kind of shattered that narrative, I think, last season. 24% of his games he scored over 100. I believe he scored 5 tons in his 21 games, so he really did show his ceiling. And it didn't even really matter, to be honest, if he was playing at the fullback spot or at the number 6 spot. I know there's a bit of talk in the preseason about Munster starting at fullback. I personally don't see it. I do think Pappenhausen won't be available for round 1. I do feel like the Storm, though, will have Nick Meaney play at fullback and keep Munster at 5'8", because I think for the overall team performance, I think they didn't look as slick with Munster at the back and Meaney at 5'8". I think keeping Munster at 5'8" is what I think that they should do, but I'm not Craig Bellamy, so I don't make those decisions. That's just my personal feeling. But again, I don't think it matters, to be honest, if Munster's playing at 6 or fullback. I think if you are paying top dollar for your 5'8", I would go obviously with Cam Munster, and I would prioritize him over someone like Dylan Brown. Whilst I love Dylan Brown, the base stats are really good. He's a similar vein. He's never going to give you a bad score because an average of 35 base is actually crazy. Like, he's always going to give you probably minimum 50 points a game. My thing is the draw. Melbourne Sharks, Manly, Penrith and the Roosters. I know Dillbags did pretty good against some top 8 opposition last season. I do also want to be a little bit more hesitant in the sense that he did have a bit of a career year. I would probably expect that at least in the early stages there may be some regression. No Reid Marnie as well, no Isaiah Papali'i, bit of a change up in their squad. We have to maybe see how Josh Hodgson works with the Eels, as a starting number 9. So for those couple of reasons, I'm personally not looking at starting with Dylan Brown this season. Round 6, I've said the same thing with Sean Lane and Mitchell Moses. The Eels go into a really good patch of games from round 6, and they're really good for bye coverage. They play in all the major bye weeks. Dylan Brown being a non-state of origin player, being a New Zealander, I think he really becomes very appealing at that stage. So my hope is that he reduces in price come round 6-7, and then we can pick him up, and he could be a nice long-term pick. Maybe if you've made a bit of cash generation and you can upgrade your reserve cheapie 5'8" potentially. So I think starting out, I would go with Munster over Dylan Brown. Just one other thing on Munster as well. I mentioned that I don't see him in a lot of teams, and I feel like that's probably because most people are spending big on their fullbacks as well as looking to shove in Nathan Cleary and Nicho Hynes. And originally when I first opened the SuperCoach app and I was actually making my team, to be honest, when I saw Munster's price of 848k, I didn't really consider him, to be honest. I just stuck Nicho Hynes in there. But I'm more and more thinking about it, thinking, could I take that maybe 50k saving on Nicho Hynes and instead go with Munster? Because Munster does have really good draw rounds 2, 3, 4, Bulldogs, Titans, and the West Tigers. But again, someone like Munster, the draw doesn't even really matter, to be honest. I think the reason I'm still leaning towards maybe using that money for Nicho versus Cam Munster, I think Nicho's just got that bigger ceiling than Munster and more likely to, I think, give you a genuine captain option. So that's probably why I personally think in round 1, whilst I think he's going to be tremendous, and look, any team that gets sent to me with Munster, I'll say, yep, looks sweet. I personally don't think I'm going to go with him round 1. I think it's also due to the appeal of guys like Adam Doueihi and Matt Burton. But I think I will try to create a couple of drafts with Munster and see how that looks. And look, there may be a good chance that I do end up starting with him, if I feel very differently, because I do think that, he's going to maintain that 80 average, to be honest. I don't see a lot of regression. The one counter could be that, Melbourne have lost a few forwards. Maybe the team cohesion won't quite be there. But I also feel like Munster's just too good of a player. So that really doesn't concern me as much. I don't think there's too much regression. I feel like he may average 75 for the first 6 weeks. So he may lose some cash. But when you've got games like in rounds 2, 3, 4, you could see Munster easily crack the 100. So definitely would advise, he's the best gun 5'8" to go for. But personally, I'm not probably looking to go there, I think, in round 1. AJ Brimson, we'll quickly talk about him. The reason for the asterisk next to his name is that he's dual listed. You can pick him up at fullback or 5'8". I would recommend, if you are looking at AJ Brimson, I'd probably advise to go with him at 5'8", just because that you've got other guns like Latrell, Turbo, Tedesco, maybe a Drinkwater. There's a few other good options at fullback. So I think I'd make the argument to try to get Brimson at the 5'8" spot. Again, personally, I'm probably not looking at him too much. The draw is good for the first 2 weeks, Tigers and Dragons, but then he immediately runs into Melbourne, the Cowboys, and then a bye. So, the first 2 weeks might be good, but then after that, you're looking at 3 pretty tough games. And again, with the Titans, I kind of would prefer to do a wait and watch scenario with them. Brimson has been good in the past. 2020, we saw that table. He averaged very well coming out at fullback. Last season, Brimson was kind of being used either both in the fullback and the 5'8" spot. He only played 7 games where he was actually listed at fullback, and in those games he averaged 53, which is obviously a lot further down compared to what he's actually priced at. But I do want to caveat that in those 7 games, he did versus the Panthers, the Roosters, the Sharks, as well as the Canberra Raiders. So there's a few good, top 8 opposition in there. So I wouldn't look at those numbers and think he's going to be worse performing at fullback. I think he just had unfortunate timing with those games, being tough opposition. But 673k, to me, the appeal of someone like Adam Doueihi or Matt Burton, they probably look a little bit better than Brimson. So he's very much a pod, 1.7% owned. But again, those percentage stats about reaching that ceiling of 100 doesn't really appeal too much to me, and I probably would prefer the upside of someone like Doueihi Burton, who do have that goal kicking. I'll quickly also mention Cody Walker, pretty low owned, 3.5%. That's probably due to the fact that he had a pretty poor 2022 and the draw is not good either. You can see pretty tough games there. Sharks, Penrith, Roosters, Manly, Melbourne in the first 5 weeks. And I think we also just saw at the back end of last season, the Rabbitohs were doing really well at the back end of last season. It was kind of Latrell being the main man. So, Walker's season average was 57. In that run of games when Latrell returned in round 16, from then until the end of the season, Cody Walker's average was 63. So there was a slight uptick, but you weren't seeing like a 10 to 15 point improvement with the whole Rabbitohs team doing well. So that's why personally I feel like that team is now more centered around Latrell. Latrell's got the goal kicking as well, and Cody Walker doesn't have goal kicking. So I think the combination of that draw and him may not being quite the main man anymore, at least for the first 5 weeks, means I'm not really looking at Cody Walker. But Adam Doueihi, Matt Burton, I know there's been a ton of questions about this, so I'll quickly mention some of the numbers for Doueihi because it does look a little bit strange. You can see in his over 60% games and over his games where he scored 60 and his games where he scored over 100, I've added in a couple of asterisk numbers. What I did there was, Adam Doueihi only played, I think, like 11 or 12 games last season. So what I've just looked at is the difference between the entire season versus the games where he actually played the full 80 minutes when he was kind of back from his, being eased back in from his injury. So you can see obviously a little bit of a difference there. In those 80-minute games, he averaged 44% of the time scoring over 60 and 11% of the time scoring over 100. So the percentage of games over 60 was similar to Matt Burton, who was at 42%. But obviously, Doueihi did get that big ton against the Broncos when played a lot less games compared to Matt Burton. Only 4% of the times did he actually score over 100 in the season. So in this slide, I wanted to tackle the question of Burton or Doueihi, or potentially both, or potentially neither, in its own category, because I do feel like this is a really big 50-50 that a lot of coaches are battling with. And look, I'm in the same boat as well. I'll quickly pop up on screen as well a poll that I put out on Twitter, which was essentially, if you're looking between either one of Doueihi or Burton, or both or neither, what would you choose? And you can see that it's very tight between Burton and Doueihi. 35% said they would go for Matt Burton, 27% Doueihi. Surprisingly, 27% said they would go for both, which actually suggests that a lot of people just can't make up their minds, and so they're thinking, I'll just go with both. Or they could be thinking, these are both really good options, therefore I'll go with both of them. And only 11% are going with neither. So I think you can kind of see then that if you're looking to go with neither of these two, you are probably in the minority. And I personally do feel like I want to have at least one of them. I'll just quickly tackle Broomer_23's question as well that I pulled from Twitter. Essentially what he's asking is, are we all getting sucked into Matt Burton because of his cheaper price compared to those other 5/8s, and also with the expectation that he may improve, because now that the Bulldogs have recruited a lot, they've got a new coach in, they've got Kickow, a lot of other good additions like Reid Marnie as well. So I think we're all expecting that the Bulldogs will probably improve straight away. Now, I don't personally think people are getting sucked in for any bad reasons. I do think it is valid to think that the Bulldogs and the Tigers will both improve. They both have recruited well. And I think we've seen enough from both of these two guys who do goal kick. So I do really like that about them. I do think that there is going to be definite improvement on their averages from last season. To give you my honest opinion, I actually prefer Doueihi to Matt Burton. And I kind of got to that opinion just by looking a little bit more at the numbers and also just comparing their draws as well. So in this table, I've got it a little bit differently, where I've tried to do a more fair comparison by looking at their 80-minute games from 2022. And in Doueihi's 9 games, 3 times he scored over 70, 1 time he cracked the ton, but only 1 time he also scored below 40. And I think those stats do make sense to me when I look at that column chart below me. Doueihi's base stat average in those 80-minute games was 32, so he's got a really high floor. Add in the goal kicking, if you think that the Tigers are going to score maybe 2 tries a game at minimum, that adds maybe 8 points to Doueihi. So you're looking at a minimum floor of about 40 for Doueihi each week, plus the fact that he's very involved in the attack. So I think Doueihi gives you a nice safe floor that I would say Matt Burton probably doesn't quite give you, because if you look at Matt Burton in comparison, of his 24 games, 80 minutes last season, 10 times he scored under 40. His base stat average is 22, so it's a lot less than someone like Doueihi. I'd probably say they've got maybe equivalent ceiling. Burton only actually once scored over 100, but he did have a lot of kind of 80s and 90s scores. You can see 9 times he scored over 70. So I think Burton's probably going to be maybe more consistently hitting those kind of 70s, which is great, to be honest, but he can also throw you in those slightly 25-30 scores, which we saw actually at the last 4 weeks of last season. So I feel like Doueihi's going to be a bit more safer in terms of his floor, but probably has an equivalent ceiling to Matt Burton. And just looking at the draw as well, the first 3 weeks look really good for the Tigers. You got the Titans at home, Newcastle at home, the Bulldogs away. Does obviously go into a bit of a tougher patch there with Melbourne, Broncos and Parramatta. But to be honest, Broncos, Doueihi scored 100 on them last season. Parramatta, I do think are a team that can concede points as well for SuperCoach. Does have the bye in week 7, which doesn't really help. And, obviously Burton's got a game there against Parramatta. Then coming out of that bye for Doueihi, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Manly's probably okay, Dragons is probably good, but Penrith away, Souths away and Cowboys at home is difficult. And then they both have the bye in round 13. If I were to compare that with Matt Burton's, I'd say the opening kind of 7 weeks are probably a little bit more difficult than Adam Doueihi. Manly away and Melbourne away, probably not ideal. West Tigers and New Zealand are great. But then immediately going into the Cowboys, Rabbitohs, Parramatta and Sharks, the rounds 9 onwards definitely is in Burton's favour. Dragons, Raiders, Warriors and then the Titans. So I think I favoured Doueihi's early draw more and I favoured Burton's later draw, I guess, if you're looking at this 13-week window. So maybe that makes me think, could I just start with Doueihi, think that he'll come out of the blocks quicker, maybe make a move to Burton in the future, maybe also with the knowledge that there could be some growing pains for the Bulldogs. So if you're looking at maybe slightly tougher opening few weeks, maybe you can afford to go without him. Start with Doueihi, he's got the good draw, he's less likely to give you those kind of bad scores, and then maybe you can make the switch at that point in time. That's something that I have been thinking about, and just also looking at the numbers related to the averages versus top 8 and also bottom 8 teams. Surprisingly, Burton didn't really deviate too much. Like, he was 54.5 average against the top 8, but then a 53.5 against the bottom 8. Whereas Doueihi was a 54.4 against the top 8, but 83 against the bottom 8. Now, if I take away that one game that he scored really big against the Broncos, that number does reduce to a 70 average. But it kind of, very obviously it's a small sample size for Doueihi, but it did show me that he's maybe more likely to be a bit of a flat track bully in comparison to, say, a Burton. So I think it probably shows you that overall it's a very 50-50 decision. I am leaning towards Doueihi because I do like the fact that his floor is a little bit higher, and I do prefer his draw a little bit more as well. And so I'm also looking at this as an opportunity where maybe I could take an anti-pod route, because if you saw in the previous section, at Burton is close to 40% ownership and Doueihi was about 15%. So I think I'm looking at there, could I take the more pod route that may get me the advantage early in the season? Starting with both, to be honest, I have definitely built a draft with both of them, because I do think, while I prefer Doueihi, I think Burton is going to be great. A 56.5 average last season, I would expect that he's more likely to actually get towards the kind of 60 to maybe 65 average this season. I'm just thinking whether it happens earlier on in the season, or maybe can I wait and get him a little bit later into the season. That's kind of my piece, I think, on the Burton versus Doueihi debate. I know a few people have also asked questions about, would you, instead of, say, having just one or the other, maybe sacrifice like a second row forward, but instead run a Burton and Doueihi combination? Initially, I was thinking, yes, I would sacrifice that second row forward and then have both of these guys. But more that I'm thinking about it now, some people are thinking, would I sacrifice like a day for feeder to instead then be able to afford Matt Burton? I think it also does come down to the availability of cheapies. Like, let's say, for example, if we don't get any good cheapies in the second row forward, then you're probably more likely to want to have to put Josh Schuster in your second row forward. At that point, your 5'8", maybe it does work out better for you to go, two of these guys, Burton and Doueihi. But if there's a good crop of second row forward cheapies, then, it probably makes good sense to have Schuster in your 5'8 reserve, and therefore you only have to pick one of these guys. In that instance, I'd probably lean towards Doueihi, but I have to give it a bit more thought, I think, with preseason, because losing someone like a gun secondary forward like Fifita, I don't love it, because Fifita can punch out that upside that maybe these guys also can. So definitely one that we need to think about more in the preseason, but in a straight 50-50, I prefer Doueihi. Now, with all that out of the way, we can quickly touch on some mid-range / other value options. But I think what's worthwhile to note here is that if you look at the ownership percentage for a lot of these guys, they're all owned by less than 3% of super coaches. And I think that really is just because people are looking at either Dillbags, Cam Munster, or Adam Doueihi, or Matt Burton. And to be honest, I kind of agree with that. None of these guys on this list here really thrill me. I think Tom Dearden is probably the best of the rest in terms of that kind of gun 5'8 category. He had a pretty good season, averaging 58 last year. 48% of the time he was scoring over 60. But I do think that he did have to score a lot of tries to get to that kind of an average. He scored 8 tries last season, and also just the numbers don't really thrill me. Like, the base stats are okay, but he's just not the main creative force, I think, for the Cowboys. Well, he was good. Like, don't get me wrong, he's a very good footballer. I think they just got many avenues to score points in terms of the actual NRL team. Chad Townsend can contribute. Someone like a Val Holmes, you've got like strike weapon like him. You had Hamiso last season as well. You had Nanai. You had Reece Robson through the middle. I think they were just a very good, cohesive team. It meant that they didn't need to solely rely on their halves, I think, to create. And so for that reason, I think Dearden's ceiling was a little bit lower, and so overall the stats don't really kind of give me any confidence. Like, I'm looking at some of the games where he scored tries. The games where he scored tries, 109, granted, very, very good score, but he did, I think, have like 2 or 3 try assists in that game. But other games where he scored a try, 64, 42, 57, 55, 79. So there's a couple of good scores in there, but it's those games where he scores a sub 60 with a try. It doesn't really give me that much confidence, because so if I compare someone like a Dearden to an Adam Doueihi, I was talking about his floor being around 40 to 45. If you add in a try with maybe another goal kick, that already gets Doueihi's kind of floor with a try to over 60, in the mid 60s. And I think someone like Doueihi is going to be much more focal to that Tigers attack in comparison to someone like a Dearden. Overall, Dearden doesn't really strike me as a great Supercoach asset. Now, Jarome Luai is an interesting option as well. He had a really good season in 2020 when he was kind of a cheapie that a lot of people went for. But I think we've seen over the last 2 seasons, he's kind of regressed from a Supercoach standpoint. He's gone from a 62 average in 2020 to a 59 in 2021 and a 56 in 2022. Now, obviously, without Coruscant, that may mean that Luai needs to have a bit more of a hand in the attack. Maybe the numbers do go up. But I think when you've got an early buy in round 3, and I think when a lot of people are looking at starting with Nathan Cleary, Luke Garner, maybe a Brian To'o, I don't think you need to overload too much and add also Jarome Luai to that mix. And I think you can afford to wait. You know, it's not like the first 4 games are super easy either. You know, Broncos, Rabbitohs, a bye, and then Parramatta. You can maybe wait till rounds 5 and 6, see how things are going with Luai. Does he look like a good option? Maybe you could get him at that point, but even then you'd expect Luai to then be involved in Origin. And so it's just those numbers and the kind of the downwards trend over the past few seasons doesn't fill me with great confidence. So again, he's not someone I'm really considering seriously. Next 3 guys I kind of all view as really good NRL players, but it doesn't quite translate into Supercoach. Although to be fair, Ezra Mam was actually really good at points during last season, but that was also just due to the fact that he was 1, a cash cow, and 2, he also had 5'8" and halfback dual listing, so he was super useful when you wanted to kind of, you know, be a bit more flexible, I think, with your team. But with Broncos draw not being the best for the first couple of weeks, he doesn't goal kick. I'm not expecting that average points to really be that much higher than what he presented from last season. So I think at 580k, you know, you're not spending that much more to get to someone like Matt Burton, who I do think is going to have a much better ceiling and much better improvement on their average. So Ezra Mam, again, doesn't quite fit the bill for me. Jack Whiten, we know, is a gun NRL player, but we've seen it season after season. He's just not quite a Supercoach gun. His last 4 seasons averages have been 52, 47, 58, and 53. That was followed by 56 and 53. So again, I think you're kind of getting the story with Jack Whiten. He's kind of going to be your mid-50s averaging player. So for me, it doesn't really appeal to me as an option. And Luke Keary, he does have spells of games where he can go on these runs where, you know, we saw in 2021 with the first 3 weeks, he averaged like 75. I think he can go on those spells. Again, I just get concerned with Luke Keary. Big concussion risk as well. You know, if he does get a concussion, he's at risk of having, you know, to take like an extended leave because he's had so many concussions in his playing career. So that's one thing that weighs against him. The base stats aren't good, you know, an average of 18. So he really needs to rely on those creative numbers to be able to bump up his average. And so whilst it can happen, because Keary's a gun NRL player, and you've got Dolphins and Warriors in the first 2 weeks, another early buy in round 4. If you're overloading with Teddy, maybe an Angus, maybe a Dan Tupou, maybe a Brandon Smith, I don't think you want to overcommit on too many Roosters players and then leave yourself short, especially in a key position like your 5'8". So Keary for me, again, doesn't really fit the bill for me. And it's a similar narrative again with Foran, Milford and Moylan. You know, Matt Moylan did actually have a spell last season where he was actually quite good Supercoach wise and was averaging, I think, over 65. But again, Sharks draw is not the best. Is he really the best option you want in your 5'8"? He's kind of in an awkward price, 528k. He might get you 50 to 55 a week, but he's not really going to go up in price, which is what you want at the start of the season, nor is he going to give you those outright gun scores to be able to capitalize on. So personally, again, can't really recommend Moylan. Foran and Milford, it's the same thing. Milford, how do we know how well the Dolphins are going to go? They may struggle at the beginning, and Foran has just never really been Supercoach relevant, to be honest, so can't really advise any of these guys in this mid-range / value list. And finally, touching on a couple of cheapies, I think Josh Schuster is close to a must-have. I haven't got his ownership listed here, but it's about 62%. I believe he is the highest owned player in Supercoach at the moment. He's probably looking to be the starting 5'8" for Manly. Yes, they've got a buy in round 2, but he's almost bottom dollar. he's shown a couple of seasons back that he can be an actual Supercoach gun as well, averaging 60 plus. So for me, there's no reason not to have Schuster. It just kind of comes down to your squad structure, which I mentioned earlier. Do you want to have him in your 5'8 spot, or do you want to have it in your second row forward spot? I think that will kind of get decided for us based on the amount of cheapies that we potentially get in the second row forward position, but I think you have to have him somewhere in your team. I've listed Jaden Sullivan here. Some people were looking at him as a reserve 5'8". He's picked up a bit of a preseason injury. I believe he should be fit for round 1, but then you've got to buy it in round 1. Awkwardly priced, I think, as well at 319k. And I just don't see a good argument to go with him when you can lock in Schuster as a cheaper dual option in your 5'8", and then you can have a gun like a Munster, a Doueihi, a Burton, maybe a Dill Bags as well. So Sullivan for me doesn't really appeal. I have also listed here Metcalf from the Warriors and Katoa from the Dolphins. Katoa is very popular, but I mentioned it in the halfback video. I don't think he's going to get a start in their team, and even if he does feature in their season, there's a potential risk maybe that he just comes on as a utility, maybe plays a few minutes. He could be a bit of an auto emergency nightmare, and so I think there's no reason to start with him. I would only look to get him when we know that he's a good chance of actually playing a consistent run of games. And Metcalf is a potential option in the halves, but I do think that the halves are likely to be Sean Johnson and Tamara Martin with Charles Nickel-Klukstad at fullback. So I think Metcalf could be next in line. So one that's maybe worth keeping an eye out on, but I think I wouldn't advise him again to start the season unless we get some confirmation, say in round 1, that he is actually going to be a starting half for the Warriors. But that's kind of a summary of the cheapies. Schuster stands out, and I don't really like any of the others. Alright guys, that is my breakdown of the 5'8 position. Hopefully you all enjoyed that. You enjoyed the stats and the summary and some of the analysis. So if you did, really would appreciate a thumbs up on the video. Please consider subscribing as well to see more content during the preseason as well as the season. Next video will be on the center wing, so there's going to be a lot of players to talk about. I won't be surprised if that video goes on for forever, but please bear with me when we get to that video. Drop any center wing related questions into the comments, as well as any other 5'8 questions as well, and I'll see you all in the next video.